Pastor, let me start with you. It's in the waiting, I believe. So if we have an in God counter and we know we have a big calling on our lives, but our leadership and nobody else doesn't recognize it, what do we do, Pastor?
Boy, that is a great question, Dr. Ken. I think that in the waiting process is where we get fully matured. Between the call and the commission. Between the call, we have an encounter with God and he calls us, to the commission where he sends us. In between is the maturation process. So when you're conceived in the womb, you're not immediately birthed out of the womb. There's a 9-month maturation process where you're being seasoned, developed, where you grow. And then the birthing comes, and then you're commissioned in the earth. Joseph was 13 years between the pasture to the palace. But in between the call in the pasture and the commission in the palace, the second in command over all of Egypt, he went through a maturation, a growth, a development, a seasoning process. And he went from the pasture to the pit. From the pit, he went to Potiphar's house. From Potiphar's house, he went to the prison house. From the prison house, he went to the palace. And then from the palace, he began to prophetically operate in his call, and 2 nations were saved. Had Joseph gone from the pasture directly to the palace, what would he have done with his brothers? He might have used his position to get even. Instead, God developed character and forgiveness in him. And in between the pasture and the palace, the maturation process was complete. And now he was able to love his brothers who'd forsaken him, turned on him, thrown him in a pit, and he was used to save his own family. So you see this same pattern with David on the run for 9 to 13 years from King Saul.
Right.
King Saul is anointed with a vial of oil. David is anointed with a horn of oil. This is interesting. King Saul gets a vial of oil, which is only 1/3 the amount of oil that King David was anointed with as a horn. Saul's anointed to be king, goes immediately into office, and doesn't have the character. And he falls and ends up suicidal, right? And demonized.
Right. Amen.
David has a triple portion of the Holy Spirit. He's anointed not just to be king, but prophet, priest, and king. And in the maturation process, character is developed in him. And he ends up king of Judah and Israel with a triple portion inheritance. So the greater the call, often the longer the hiddenness is. I want to give you an illustration. By the way, this happened with Moses on the backside of the mountain for 40 years, right? He went from killing an Egyptian with the rod of a man's authority in his hand to getting the rod of God's authority in his hand on the backside of the mountain, comes out, and he delivers 3 million with God's authority. But character has to be developed. Between the call and the commission lies the maturation. But think about this. If you have a very high calling with a double or a triple portion of the Holy Spirit on your life, often God has to do a breaking process behind the scene to develop character, because the gifts of God he can pour out overnight, but the character is developed over time. And the gifts of God without the character of God is a recipe for disaster. But think about this. In the Old Testament, during Solomon's reign, when he built the temple, there was an interesting passage. It talks about how the stonemasons, cut the stones, chiseled the stones, sanded the stones. They did all the stonework off-site. There was no sound of stone making and chiseling and breaking and cracking and sanding at the temple. It was all done off-site. Then the stones were brought and pieced together without any noise. We are a holy habitation. We are living stones, a spiritual house. And when God develops us,
That's good.
he develops us off-site they didn't recognize me. They don't know who I am. God, you told me this about me. We whine, we complain, and it's all off site to where people can never use it against us in our character development process. And when we're finally ready, fully baked, the stone is perfectly cut, he gets all the rough edges off of us, then he takes us from hiddenness to manifestation, and he puzzle piece fits us in with the other people who are just like us, that he's taken from every parts of the earth, and then he puts a ministry together, a team together, a spiritual house together that reflects his glory instead of our issues.
Well done. Let me